This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, begins today's show by discussing topics that have recently come across his desk. He talks about the new H-2A rules, right to first refusal, and aerial crop dusting liability. K-State beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner continues the show with reminders on importance of water for cattle during the summer. The show comes to an end with K-State's Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Phillip Lancaster, Bob Larson, and Lilli Heinen with another segment from the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. The group provides recommendations for 4-H calf feeding, handling, and record keeping. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, today wanting to talk about some different things that have been coming across your desk in a multitude of different ways. And first, talking about the new rules with the H-2A program. And can you give us a refresher on what is the H-2A program?
Well, Shelby, that's the temporary ag worker program that helps employers who anticipate a lack of available domestic workers. And so if you have foreign workers that are brought to the U.S. to perform either temporary or seasonal ag work for such things as planting and cultivating and harvesting, then this is the program that will assist those farming operations, or at least it's designed to assist those farming operations in finding those workers. But, of course, once you are in the program, then you become subject to the rules of that program.
And those rules have recently had some changes?
That's right. Effective June 28th, there's a new final rule that the Department of Labor has published that will take effect. And that is a rule that will impact the temporary farm worker program. And its stated purpose is to increase wage transparency and state when an employee can be terminated for cause and prevent employer retaliation against temporary seasonal ag workers. Plus, there are expanded safety requirements and more employer disclosure requirements and new rules for self-advocacy of workers.
What are a few of those different things that are impacting the workers and farmers?
Well, it's going to be more difficult for a covered employer to terminate workers because the rule has new restrictions on the employer's ability to terminate workers for cause. You've got to go through quite a labyrinth of warnings and write-ups and all those types of things before you can terminate a worker, and then there are additional rights those workers have. So it's much more detailed process for terminating workers under the program. And workers that are under the H-2A program have the right to get paid for 3/4 of the hours offered in the work contract, even if the work ends early. And also that same rule, this same rule gives them housing and transportation until the worker leaves, and payment for outbound transportation. And if the worker is a U.S. worker, they have to be contacted for employment in the next year unless they're terminated for cause.
So what is for cause really when it comes to termination?
Well, basically when the employer demonstrates that the worker has failed to comply with employer policies or rules, or has failed to satisfactorily perform job duties after they've been issued, as I mentioned, progressive discipline, unless, as the rule says, the employee has engaged in egregious misconduct, or I should say the worker has engaged in egregious misconduct. So basically what this is saying is that the employer, the farm operation, must have pretty detailed policies or rules in place detailing what the job duties are and what the expectations are and what the discipline levels are going to be. And I think there's probably a lot of farming operations, particularly smaller ones, that don't have that established set of procedures in place, and they need to have that done under this new rule.
And Roger, within this article that you shared, there's also a point that talks a lot about a seatbelt.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because under the rule, vehicles that are required by the Department of Transportation regs to be manufactured with seatbelts. In those vehicles, the farm employer has to retain and maintain those seatbelts in good working order, and you cannot operate the vehicle unless each worker is wearing a seatbelt. So that's going to be an interesting one. The enforcement of that one I really kind of wonder about.
And when are people going to be required to follow this new ruling?
Well, as I said, it takes effect June 28, but there's kind of a time frame here where people can get used to the new rule because only applications for H-2A employer certifications that are submitted to the Department of Labor on or after August 29 will be subject to the new rule. So there's a transition period. Yes, the rule becomes effective June 28, but it only really applies to certifications submitted to Department of Labor on or after August 29. So you've got that transition period of a couple of months.
What would you recommend for farms who use this H-2A temporary ag worker program to go ahead and get started with?
Well, there's a good list of information on the Department of Labor's website about what employers need to be doing to start to get ready to comply with this new rule, and that's probably a good place to go. But this is an important rule. There are a number of farming operations in Kansas, obviously, and in the plains and out west and in the south that are in the program and do utilize the program. So it's important for these farming operations to be aware of what this new rule is because the penalties can be rather severe depending on what is violated.
Roger, another topic you've come across mentioned in your recent blog article, the right of first refusal. And what is the right of first refusal?
Well, a right of first refusal allows the holder of the right the ability to buy property on the same terms that's offered to another bona fide purchaser. And so, maybe I'm a tenant or maybe I'm a family member and I want to buy that farmland. Well, what this right gives me, and I want to get it in writing, is the ability to have the right to buy that property on the same terms if it's offered to somebody else as a bona fide purchaser. And so once I'm notified of that right, I can either choose to buy the property on those terms or decline and allow that property to be sold to somebody else. So it gives me the first crack at that property. It's not going to be sold out from underneath me. And that's pretty useful, I think, in many ag land transaction situations where there's a desire to ensure that a particular party has a chance to acquire the property.
And on the seller side of things, really important that is offered?
Right. It is. It's critical that the property actually be offered to the holder of the right before it's sold to someone else. So if I'm wanting to sell property, but I've given a right of first refusal to somebody else, then I take the offer that I've received and provide that to the holder of the right to see if they want to exercise the right. If I don't do that and I ignore that right of first refusal and go ahead and sell to the third party, then the holder of the right can sue me for monetary damages, and the third party that either had actual or constructive notice of the right of first refusal can be sued for specific performance. So you want to get these things in writing, and then you want to abide by them.
You just mentioned it, but reiterating a point you often make that it's important to record everything and have your ducks in a row.
Right. Not only get the right of first refusal in writing, I think it's a good idea to record it on the land records to put the public and any potential buyer on notice. And then also, I think it's a good idea to investigate changes concerning the property. One might be to who are the lease payments being made to. So I think the holder of the right has to stay vigilant to protect their right.
One more topic for us to touch on that is from your recent blog article, From the Desk and Email and Phone, aerial crop dusting.
Yeah, that's a big issue, and there was a news story out of Texas, Shelby, just last week where two crop dusters collided midair, and one was killed. One miraculously is as far as I know, as we talk, is still living. But the point of what I was writing was on the liability issue, and that story really brings that liability issue home. If I'm the farming operation that is having the crop dusting done, I don't want to have my employees do that, because if there's an event like what happened in Texas that occurs, I'm going to be liable to some extent, maybe to a great extent, as the employer. So I want to hire an independent contractor to do my crop dusting, and if there's a mistake, if there's drift that damages somebody else's crops, or there is a collision like this, then that's not my problem. That's my concern, but it's not my problem from a legal standpoint. And there may be some state-level regulations that come into play, too. For example, in Arkansas, violation of aerial crop spraying regs constitutes evidence of negligence, and that negligence of crop sprayers can be imputed to landowners if it's an employee. That's why I reiterate again, you always want to hire an independent contractor in these types of situations.
And Roger, as we're talking about these are just a few topics that I'm sure you hear about most days. And so how do you go about sorting through and finding really the value in topics you're being asked?
Well, that's a good question, Shelby. I do get numerous questions every single day, and if I were to count them up on an annual basis, it's probably in excess of 3,000 to 4,000, I think, easily over the course of a year. And they vary on all topics like this, and I just try to take them as they come in, and some are more urgent than others, and some it takes me quite a while to get to, and so that's just kind of a snippet of some of the things that I've had to deal with recently.
If people would like to read more on the topics that we talked about today or other topics, how can they do that?
That can be found on my website, Washburnlaw.edu /WALTR, or on the AgManager website through the Department of Ag Econ at K-State.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us a few things that you've been hearing about.
My pleasure.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. The topics we talked about today came from a recent blog article of his titled From the Desk and Email and Phone, Ag Law Style. If you'd like to read more about these topics and other topics, you can find this article linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by going to Washburnlaw.edu /WALTR. Again, that's Washburnlaw.edu /WALTR. You can also find it by going to AgManager.info, clicking on Contributors and selecting Roger McEowen. We're getting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll be joined by Justin Waggoner, K-State beef cattle specialist, to talk about the value of water for cattle this time of year. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show by talking about water for cattle with Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Justin, water is something that's really important for all species, but today really wanting to focus on water for cattle.
Yeah, so sure. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Water is one of our essential nutrients for all livestock, and it's especially important as, as we think of this year, we're really starting to get into those really extreme summer temperatures. And, the classic example of that I think highlights the importance of water for me is if you're a livestock person, and that feeling you get when you find the tank is dry and the animals are huddled around a dry tank. I don't think there's any worse feeling in the world for anyone, regardless of the species of livestock. And so, we know water is especially important for cattle and especially performance and just really driving all those essential processes, right? That's why water is life. I think that's one of the common slogans we hear somewhere, but it's really, one of those fundamental things, especially as we talk about livestock production.
What are some of those water requirements for cattle?
Sure. So, as we kind of jump into that, there's a few things that can impact water requirements. Obviously, the big one is stage production, right? If we have a lactating animal that's producing milk, their water requirements are going to be higher. So some of the other things that can influence, water demand or need for those animals is going to be, what's the water or moisture content of the diet? Obviously, there's a big difference in terms of confined cattle. If we have an 85% dry matter ration versus we have a 45% dry matter ration. So as we get into those wetter rations with silage, if we're on some sort of a grazed forage program that's going to have a lot higher moisture content, obviously those cattle they still have the same water requirement. They're just going to drink less out of the tank, if that makes sense. So we are going to get some of that from the diet. One of the other factors that's out there is, we talked a little bit about this earlier before we came on air, but water quality, right? What's the quality of the water in the tank? And so that can certainly influence, how much of that water that those cattle are going to consume. And so, as we think about, those type of factors, right? And then there's the real obvious one of temperature, right? So as we think as the temperature goes up, right, water consumption is going to go up. So typically that's about 1 to 2 gallons per 100 pounds of body weight is where that requirement is going to go out. So for every 10-degree increase in temperature above 40, typically that goes up by about a gallon. So Now, here's this kind of the scary part, if you will. So once we go above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, really regardless of, the weight of the animal, stage of production, et cetera, we're looking at in excess of 20 gallons per head per day. So you can easily see once we get into these really extreme summer temperatures, it's just a good rule of thumb is 20 gallons per head per day is probably going to be the minimum. We may see some increases above that, especially as we get into those more extreme temperatures well above that 90-degree mark, which that's kind of where our research goes up to, is about 90 degrees, so we don't have a lot of that water consumption data above that. But we also have to keep in mind water consumption is highly variable, right? Depending on a lot of those different factors that can all come into play. And just like there's certain humans will drink more water than others, there's going to be some cattle that are likely going to require more water than others as well. So there is quite a large amount of variability in terms of water needs and consumption voluntary consumption anyways, between animals.
Justin, you mentioned water quality, and wanting to come back to that real fast and mention that it is important to take the time to clean out your tanks every once in a while for your cattle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always things that don't get done in the cusp of livestock production, right? We get the cows turned out. We're, kind of focused on the next stage of production. And so, I always remind producers, especially if you've got those pastures and those very large stock tanks, it's a good idea to clean those out at least once a year. Maybe pay a special attention to that, right? I know, once we get into confined situations, that's a little easier where we have to walk past that tank every day. It's a lot easier to forget those tanks that are out on those more extensive environments. But certainly water quality and hygiene are going to play a big role in that, right? We'd like that water to be, somewhat clean, right, for those livestock as well. So just take an extra minute and clean out those tanks is always a really good hygiene practice, I think. At least typically we like to do that when we first turn the cattle out. I think that's always a good practice, just go by and kind of check on those stock tanks as we make sure that well's got some functionality when we're checking things out. Just go ahead and clean the tank and flush things out and get it clean.
With 20 gallons per head per day, it's important that those cattle can get around that tank also to get water?
Yeah, so one of the other things that often comes up when we have these conversations about water, especially this time of year as well, we talked about the question of, well, how much water do these cows need? So we've kind of covered that. And then there's the question of, well, tank capacity, how much water will a given tank hold per se? And oftentimes it's not necessarily the capacity of a tank that tends to be the limiter. It's more of the drinking space or the linear space around the tank that tends to determine how many animals can effectively drink out of a stock tank. So if you take, for example, the standard, I'll call it a 12-foot stock tank with 24-inch sides, that tank will easily hold enough water to support about 85 head of animals or head of cows that are out on a pasture if we take a 1,300-pound animal, et cetera. However, if we factor in the linear drinking space, so the circumference of that tank, really it can only support about 30 animals for that tank. And so, it's not necessarily we have enough water for 80 head, but really that linear drinking space is what tends to be the limiter of how many animals can effectively drink out of a stock tank. Now, there's also some other rules we need to make mention of. So we'd like there to be access for at least 10% of the animals to come up and get a drink at one time if we're in a relatively small paddock. As we get into those more extensive environments where those cattle are going to have to travel longer distances to get to water, in my mind, that's something more than a half a mile. In that case, we really need to have linear drinking capacity for about 30% of the animals in that group.
Does that sometimes mean needing to get multiple tanks?
Absolutely, and that's why it's fairly common practice as you see larger pastures and larger environments, especially in southwest Kansas, we'll either have really large concrete tanks that have been constructed on the site, or we'll have multiple of those 12 to 24 or even larger tanks that are out there. But just I always encourage producers, give some consideration to how many animals can effectively get up to this tank and drink at one time. That's going to be more of the limitation than the actual capacity of the stock tank in most cases.
As we are thinking about cattle coming up to get water, is there any concern with how the ground on the outside of the tank is holding up?
Yeah, sure. So that's a good point. I mean, one of the things, as we talk about maintenance, right? Maintenance always comes up. And so it's really common for us to see the space and the soil around those tanks to start to get eroded. And we talked earlier a little bit off air about calves. Do we need to have any concerns there? And I think the biggest concern that I see with calves is a lot of times we get those holes around the stock tank. And so we have to start asking ourselves, can those smaller calves actually get up and access that stock tank, especially once they start to consume more water as they get a little bit larger? And so always pay close attention to that. The same is true in dry lots, right? As we wean calves, oftentimes it's very common for those spaces around the bunk line, the bunk pads, as well as the water tank. Those are very common spaces for us to get some holes that we've got to go in and get those fixed and really do some pen maintenance just to make sure that those calves can get up and access that water tank.
And as we're talking about caring for our cattle, important thought to mention that the mineral or what maybe is found in the water is different around the state. And how can that impact what nutrients the cattle are needing?
Yeah, so, good point there. Oftentimes we forget that water can be a significant source of mineral, especially in certain parts of the state. And so that water, once again, coming back to water quality, right? So one of the common things that we'll hear from producers is we have this pasture and these cattle just don't consume mineral. And so one of the first things that we'll often do is encourage producers that if that is a concern, have you pulled a water sample? What's that look like? Now, obviously, there's going to be some differences. If you're in the eastern part of the state where you have surface water, that's a little more challenging in terms of how we need to take that sample. If you're using well water, say like you would be in southwest or western Kansas, that's a little easier process. But just those two things do tend to go hand in hand, and we often forget that water can be a significant source of mineral and mineral antagonisms that can cause us some production problems as well. So it's always, those two things are always go hand in hand, and it's really important to you have to take one with the other.
If people would like to learn more about this topic, how can they do that?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of resources at ksubeef.org. There's actually a publication or a short article, I guess is what I'll call it, on water that I put together a few years ago called Water Questions and Answers. And so as you get into the geometry of figuring out, well, what is the linear drinking space of a 12-foot tank? There's some formulas there where you can figure that. So even some calculations in terms of how to calculate stock tank capacity of various sizes and some formulas there. So if you're interested in any of that, certainly encourage you to pull up your search engine of choice and just type in water quality in KSU, and you'll find quite a few resources that are out there for us.
And Justin, I will link your article, Water Questions and Answers, in today's show notes on agtoday.net, as well as KSU Beef, where people can find out more information from the K-State Beef Extension team. Justin, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about giving water to cattle.
All right, thank you.
That was K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we end today's show with Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, Brian Lubbers, Bob Larson, and Lilli Heinen from the Beef Cattle Institute.
Phillip, I'm going to start with you. When we're thinking about feeding market calves for the fair, what is the most common thing that you see that people might be able to do to make that process better?
I think probably one of the most common things that I see is people underfeed or overfeed those market calves. And generally, I think underfeed. People don't realize just how much those calves eat, and they don't realize how much grain they need to get finished by fair time. And so let's say you've got a summer fair, late summer fair, and you started with a calf in the spring that was, 700 to 800 pounds, somewhere in that ballpark. He's going to eat somewhere around 25 pounds a day of total feed. And then so you need to get him up to where he's eating probably close to 20 pounds or so of grain. And so especially those last 60 days, where we're really trying to put some finish on that calf. And so making sure you're giving him enough. And so, a lot of people are using maybe a coffee can or some other way of dipping feed out of the bag or whatever for that animal. Make sure you take the time and have a scale available where you can measure how much does a coffee can of this feed actually weigh. So you can calculate, am I actually feeding him enough pounds of feed?
Great point. Brian, that ties right into one of the things you want to talk about, which was record keeping.
Yeah, for me, having a 4-H calf is it's really, what did you learn through the process, right? That's the purpose of doing this. And so we talk about records an awful lot on this podcast. And so I think it's a great time to start learning some stuff about keeping records on animals. And clearly you don't need a sophisticated herd management software to do this for a 4-H calf. But, I even go back, not just about records, what happened with that animal since you got it, right? So if you purchased it, you probably want to have a purchase price somewhere in a spreadsheet. You probably want to have an average daily gain calculator, right? So you have you might have a beginning weight, you might have an intermediate weight, and you might have a final weight before you go to the fair. So calculate some intermediate weight gains. Health records would be something you certainly want to have in a spreadsheet. So if calf was vaccinated, if it was implanted, whatever, those need to be part of your record keeping process. And if by chance it did get sick, we certainly want to have treatment records as part of our kind of our 4-H project as a whole. And I even go back further if you learn a little something about the genetics of that animal, how it was raised before you got it. And I don't know that necessarily needs to be part of your spreadsheet, but certainly part of the learning process for a young 4-H'er.
Absolutely. And Bob and Lily, what about handling halter breaking? Any advice there?
Well, that's one of my biggest advice is start well before the fair. It's that fair
like the weekend before?
Yeah, no.
How much ahead of time? For those of us that procrastinate.
Yeah. And you're that family. Yeah, okay. You're that. I'm picturing it now. So, yeah, if we're talking about a summertime fair, we're a little bit late. Let's get those calves halter broke. Partly, they're getting bigger. So from a safety standpoint, you need to get started early. And there's lots of strategies on best ways to do that. But I think, keeping some low stress handling concepts in mind, but basically teach them to, drag a halter, be tied with a halter so that they learn to be comfortable around people, and giving yourself enough time that you and the calf, the 4-H'er and the calf can really not procrastinate, not put this off. So it's time to get those calves tied up, teach them to be brushed, be handled by humans, and not be startled by that interaction.
Absolutely. Lily, any thoughts?
I was going to kind of go off of that and say also expose them to more than one person. I think I've seen a lot of times where you're in the show ring and there's a lot of people staring, a lot of people screaming, children, all that sort of thing. Not saying that you need to bring a whole fair to your farm and practice that way, but definitely get them exposed to multiple people being around the animal at a time.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.